But decadence, it seemed, at least in the official story, had a different scope in Latin America. Decadence was perceived primarily as a gesture, a pose, however dissident and political as such it was, as Silvia Molloy reclaims. Turn-of-the-century modernistas and intellectuals had a higher virile role, that of defining, inventing America, that is, Latin America. This goal presented a problem when confronted with the claims for equality by Latin American proto-feminists. While intellectuals openly stated an alliance with the subaltern in their definitions of the new nations, they failed to apply these very same ideas to the emancipation of women. The critic Javier Lasarte points to this contradiction in turn-of-the-century intellectuals such as José Martí and Manuel González Prada. Although both supported at some point the cause of the new woman in their writings, the conclusion was that the supreme role of all women in society was reproduction and domesticity. Women were perceived as the mothers of the new nations in a clearly hierarchically defined patriarchal society. The new woman did not have a space in this order and was rejected for disrupting it. In fact, I dare to say that every single female intellectual of the period, and there were many, was eventually sent into oblivion. Never studied, never quoted, completely ignored by canonical academia, only recently reclaimed mostly by feminist scholars impressed, as I am, by the high quality of their works. Adela Zamudio in Bolivia, Laura Méndez de Cuenca in Mexico, Teresa González de Fanning in Peru are just a few. So what happens when a turn-of-the-century woman wants to be more than the mother of the nation, or simply wants to do something and to be something else? What happens when the muse becomes the poet, when the object of fantasies and definitions, whether political or aesthetic, is the one who writes? This presents an arduous problem, a dilemma, according again to Silvia Molloy, who says, women cannot be at the same time intertextual objects and active authors. Within the ideological boundaries of turn-of-the-century literature, women cannot write women. End quote. So then, what and how do these women write, if they write at all? That is, if they manage to get published. And to get published implies to get public. That is, to go beyond the private, which is the traditional space assigned to women. And you know what a public woman means or meant, both in Spanish and in English. The public woman is or was the prostitute. The Uruguayan poet Delmira Agustini presents one of the best examples in life and works of intersection of notions of gender, aesthetics, and scientific political experimentation that took place during the turn-of-the-century modernista period. The date of her birth, 1886, coincides with the end of the military regime, and she grew up along with the process of modernization emphasized by the government of José Valle y Ordóñez. The model proposed by Valle intended to replace the previous demographic model based on reproduction and abundance, natural and rural, considered barbaric, with a more virile model, primarily productive, industrial, urban, and cultured. With the deliberate intention of surprising the world, however, Valle presented an explicitly feminist project. Hagamos una ley esencialmente feminista que asombre al mundo. Let's create a law essentially feminist that surprises the world, they said. In fact, his government was one of the very first in the world to give women the right of suffrage and allow them to initiate divorce. Valle designed and supported the emergence of a new woman in a process equivalent to the development of the new nation. The problem was that reality contradicted this highly progressive experiment. Many of the components of the previous model remained unresolved, as the general sensibility towards women was extremely restricted and repressive in Latin America as well as in Victorian Europe. These restrictions were common, as I mentioned before, in the literary realm. Delmira Agustini's first poems appeared in societal magazines and captured the attention of Uruguayan's preeminent intellectuals who, however, emphasized her beauty and youth over her poetry. She was called embodied angel, charming and innocent, blonde and blue, light, almost supernatural. Her first book of poems, published in 1907, was considered a miracle. And now I make a quote from Carlos Vaz Ferreira about this book. You shouldn't be able to understand, not to mention write, this book. How you were able to either understand or feel what you have written in some of your poems is something completely inexplicable, end quote. When Agustini published this book, she was 21 years old, the same age than the very famous Rubén Darío when he published his acclaimed book of poems, Azul, Blue. The mechanism of textualization, which is the conversion of the female writer into a literary object, was common in the period. In fact, women writers were not considered properly as authors, that is, writers capable of literary authority, but mostly as muses to inspire the male artist and writer and entertain the male reader. The examples are numerous. Delmira Agustini was called the new muse of America. Think of a male author perceived in a similar role. And in modernista terms, as stated by its most prominent representative, Rubén Darío, the role of the muse is clear. And I quote from his well-known Poetics, my translation. And the first law creator create. Snort the eunuch. When a muse gives you a child, leave the other 8 pregnant, end quote. Modernistas' male writers not only presented women as sexual objects in their works, more often within the traditional dichotomy of angel and prostitute, but also read and interpreted their female counterparts using the same conventions and fantasies. When Delmira Agustini started to emphasize sexual imagery in her works, which, by the way, was common among modernista male writers, critics' delicate epithets changed drastically to address the poet, not the poems, in terms such the ones used by Emir Rodriguez Monegal, who calls Delmira, and I quote, Pythoness in heat, sexually obsessed, and fevered Leda, end quote. Needless to say, this approach was never used when critics addressed male writers. Darío's frequent eroticism was considered transcendental and spiritual, while Agustini's use of eroticism was personalized, creating strong reactions which endured beyond her era. The canonical Enrique Anderson Invert, for example, author of the very influential Historia de la Literatura Hispanoamericana, History of Hispano-American Literature, says in reference to Delmira's works, quote, Delmira was like that, like a hot and humid orchid, end quote. Delmira Agustini herself assumed and cultivated this image in accordance with the modernista rhetoric and the restricted roles imposed on the women of the age. She followed all the rules, even those that promoted the feminist agenda designed by Badge, perhaps fatally. The myth of Delmira Agustini's duplicity was born in this context. In contrast with the increasingly sexual imagery of Delmira's poetry, La Nena, the baby, as Delmira was called in the private sphere, responded to the restricted societal constructs of the era that denied sexuality to their upper-class women, creating a spectrum of women that had to remain virginal until a delayed marriage, while their future husbands consolidated their positions and fortune. No wonder the so-called nervous disorders proliferated widely among upper-class women of this time. The average age for women to marry increased from 18 to 20 years in the barbaric Uruguayan model to 25, 27 years of age in the new progressive civilized model promoted by Badge and common in Victorian Europe. After years of traditional courtship, Delmira Agustini married Enrique Job Reyes in 1913, a man completely detached from the literary arena. She was almost 27 years old, that is, she was at the extreme of the statistics for marrying in the period. 6 weeks after her marriage, she asked for divorce, supported by a brand new law and a discourse of liberation promoted by anarcho-sexuals, such as the Uruguayan Roberto de las Carreras. Delmira Agustini was perhaps grown to believe in this network of libertarian support. Soon after their divorce, in one of Delmira's sexual encounters with her then ex-husband, Enrique shot her to death and then killed himself. This crime was highly publicized to the point of overshadowing for almost a century the work itself of the great poet. I remember asking my professor at the University of Pennsylvania, an expert in modernista poetry, about women poets of the period. We didn't study any, and he said that there was this woman killed by her husband. Perhaps her death, a clear yet dismissed case of domestic violence, her death was romanticized, and often the killer, Enrique, was presented as victim of Delmira's intellect, was a consequence of a decadent experiment, that of the test tube of the government of Badge, in the sense argued by Christine Ferguson in her article Decadence as Scientific Fulfillment. Science for science's sake, politics for politics' sake in the case of Delmira's Uruguay. As it was with her life, Delmira Agustini's demise coincided with the demise of the Badge regime.